Welcome to Earth Archives. In the European Middle Ages, especially in Northern and Western Europe, the name of the Viking pirates was absolutely frightening. They were like demons from hell who plundered. The lords at that time were unable to resist at all. So the disappeared Vikings. What is the origin of Kyoto? Before the show starts, please subscribe, like, and turn on the little bell. If possible, leave your thoughts. This will help the growth of the show. Without further ado, let's officially start. In the centuries before the Middle Ages, a people from the north traveled across Europe. Hundreds of years before the advent of the Age of Discovery, a nation's fleet reached America. Before the 9th century AD, Iceland and Greenland in the North Atlantic were still undeveloped lands until they were discovered by this people. They were navigators and invaders, merchants and pirates, excellent sailors and brave warriors. This nation is a heroic and fighting nation, and its name is Viking. The Viking nation, a nation that seems to only exist in legends, yet actually exists in the snow and cold of Scandinavia. The word Viking comes from the Nordic word, vik, which means, little bay. The Scandinavians of the 9th century used the term to refer to their sea expeditions. Later generations used Viking to refer to this nation that brought endless panic to Europe in the early Middle Ages. As early as around 6000 BC, the northern nomads shuttled among the many islands along the coast. They lived on fish and other marine life. More than 2,000 years later, people engaged in agriculture appeared on the peninsula. Even so, because of the criss-crossed fjords and numerous islands, boats were the Vikings' main means of transportation, and the dense forests on the peninsula and adjacent islands provided them with the best raw materials for building houses and ships. Since the productivity of the land is not high, fish and shellfish in the sea are still their main source of food. It can be said that wood and the sea constitute the center of gravity of this Nordic civilization. Over time, 3 countries gradually formed in Scandinavia: Norway, Sweden and Denmark. However, until the 8th century, the borders between these 3 countries were still blurred. Therefore, the Vikings in the medieval period were divided into 3 branches according to their countries: Norwegian Vikings, Danish Vikings and Swedish Vikings, and their paths were also different. The Ting was the parliament of the Vikings. All decisions about the Vikings' life were made in the Ting. Before the rule of the Nazis, the Viking kings and leaders were also elected by the Ting. As a result, sometimes the court grid can also represent the powers of the court. The hall holds meetings once or twice a month, and the meetings are held in the open air. The weapons of Viking warriors are battle axes or long swords. Their battle axes are single-edged axes with a barb on the tip. During the battle, the axe will cut into the opponent's chest and abdomen, and then hook and pull. The result is terrible. Generally, Viking warriors wore shields. In the early days, these shields were made of hard wood, but later they were gradually replaced by iron. During battle, some Viking warriors took a stimulant and were not afraid of pain even if their bodies were injured, in order to boost the morale of their comrades. This is how they were called berserkers. In the lives and battles of the Vikings, ships were their important support. The Vikings' shipbuilding technology was very advanced. The ships they built had pointed ends and a bow shaped like a dragon's head, so they were called dragon head ships. The warships built by the Vikings had long and narrow hulls, moved quickly, and could move forward in the opposite direction without turning around. The Vikings attached great importance to family and had a strong sense of family. They often lived as a large family on a farm or in a public courtyard. In the polygamy system implemented in the Vikings, a man could marry several wives. A legal wife, who was responsible for managing the family's property and handling housework. Other concubines belonged to the slave class. Viking conquests. Before the 8th century AD, there were only 2 million residents in Scandinavia. As the climate gradually warmed, crop yields increased, people became stronger, and the mortality rate of the elderly and newborns decreased. In addition, due to the Viking, the marriage custom of China was polygamy, so the population grew rapidly. As the population increases, the land in Scandinavia becomes very poor. A large number of young people have no jobs and have to go out to make a living. On the European continent, after the collapse of the Roman Empire in the 5th century AD, foreign races from northern and eastern Europe migrated to the lands of the original Roman Empire. As early as that time, some residents living in Scandinavia followed this torrent into Western Europe. At the end of the 8th century AD, the famous Charlemagne established the powerful Carolingian dynasty and conquered all directions, trying to restore order in Europe and rebuild the glory of the Roman Empire. However, Charlemagne's empire was smaller in both territory and national power than the powerful Roman Empire back then. It was from this time that the Vikings began their three-century expedition. After the deaths of Charlemagne and his successor Louis I, the Carolingian dynasty also began to decline, and the Viking invasion reached its peak. In the process of conquest, the three originally formed countries had their own different paths. The Norwegian Vikings plundered and invaded the British Isles and near the Mediterranean. The Danish Vikings attacked the Western European continent and plundered along several major rivers in Europe. The Swedish Vikings went east to the Slavic tribes, established the Russian Empire, and became a new nation. Norwegian Viking. In June 793, several dragon-headed warships, Draka, appeared on the edge of the British coast, quickly docked, and plundered Lindisfarne Abbey near the coast. This raid marked the advent of the Viking Age. Within a few years, the Norwegian Vikings successively attacked monasteries in places such as St. Patrick's Abbey, St. Columban Abbey, and Jarrow on the British coast, as well as coastal areas such as Iona in Scotland and the Isle of Man in the British Isles. In the Middle Ages, the power and wealth of the church were astonishing, so the Vikings often plundered churches near the coast and plundered large amounts of property. The Vikings often landed quickly in dragon-headed warships, plundered treasures and poultry, and quickly returned to the ship. They sometimes captured women and strong men and sold them as labor. In 837, the Danish Vikings landed in Northern Ireland, established the city of Dyflin, and ruled Ireland in 851. In order to compete with the Danish Vikings for Ireland, the Norwegian Vikings launched a long-term struggle with the Danish Vikings, and finally established an Irish Viking nation, including Ireland, the Isle of Man, and Western Britain. It was not until 1000 AD that the Irish, led by their leader Brombe, drove away the Vikings. At that time, the Viking Scandinavian civilization and the Celtic civilization of Ireland had merged. Many Vikings in Ireland had begun to believe in Christianity. In Norway, starting from the rulers, there were many everyone believes in ****. The last hero of the Norwegian Vikings was King Harald III. In 1066, in order to compete for the throne of England, Harold III and Stig, Earl of Northumbria, joined forces to fight against the English King Harold II who came to the throne that year. After landing, the Viking fleet quickly moved towards York and defeated the British army at Fulford on September 20. This battle greatly weakened the British army and had a profound impact on the outcome of the Battle of Hastings. However, Harold III did not see the final victory. He was defeated by Harold II's British army at the Battle of Stamford Bridge on September 25 and died on the battlefield. The conquerors landed a few days later. William took advantage of the situation and defeated Harold II and became the ruler of England. Harold III's death marked the end of the centuries-long Viking Age. Danish Viking. In 797, the Danish Vikings invaded the Carolingian Empire under Charlemagne for the first time, and invaded the empire's territory many times in the following decades. However, the Carolingian Empire was at its peak at that time, and most of the Danish Viking invasions were repelled by Charlemagne and his son Louis I in 834. The Danish Vikings invaded on a large scale and robbed the financial and commercial center Doris port. They followed the Elbe River northward, and were robbed in Rouen, Tours and other places along the way. In 840, the Carolingian dynasty began to decline and split under the influence of Charlemagne's successor Louis I, which provided an opportunity for the Danish Vikings to invade. On Easter in 885, 30,000 Danish Viking warriors sailed up the Seine River in 700 warships and arrived in Paris, referring to the old city of Paris, Isle de la Cède. After the Vikings landed, they launched a fierce attack on Paris. The king at that time, Charles the Fat, was away on an expedition, but in the city there were only 200 troops led by Bishop Baslin and Count Odo, Count of Neustria, later the King of West Francia. Night Guard. The Parisians stubbornly resisted the Viking attack, forcing the Vikings to surround the city and launch a long-term siege. The siege of Paris was not lifted until King Charles's army returned the following year to fight the Danish Vikings. However, King Charles's army did not completely defeat the Vikings, but instead signed a trade agreement with the Vikings. Later, the Vikings went up the Seine many times and plundered the areas along the coast. In 911, the French King Charles the Fool signed the St. Clair Agreement with the Danish Viking leader Rollo, which placed the area around the mouth of the Seine in northwest France under Viking rule. Rollo became the Duke of Normandy. The Viking warriors also became Normans. In 1002, King Ethelred II of England ordered the execution of all Danes on British territory, which triggered revenge from King Sven of Denmark, King of Moustache. Sven's successor, Canute the Great, conquered all of England and ascended the throne of England in 1016. Canute the Great became the King of Denmark in 1019. In 1028, he defeated Norway and Sweden and became the King of Norway. He occupied the southern part of Sweden and established the North Sea Empire, including England, Denmark, Norway, most of Scotland and southern Sweden, where the Viking conquests reached their zenith. Emperor Canute died in 1035, and his descendants did not retain the powerful empire. The death of Canute II in 1043 marked the disintegration of the Great North Sea Empire and the end of the Viking Age in Denmark. Swedish Viking. While the Norwegian and Danish Vikings were raiding Western Europe, the Swedes turned their attention to the east. In the 9th century, the Swedish Vikings set out from the Swedish coast and came to the Slavic tribes in Eastern Europe. The Vikings from Northern Europe were called Varangians or Rus by the locals. According to the Chronicles of Early Russia, written by Orthodox priests in the 12th century, in 862, the Slavs suggested to the Russians, "Our country is vast and rich in resources, but it is currently in chaos. Please come to our country to rule." And in some records, the Swedish Vikings were not rulers, but acted as mercenaries. In the 9th century, Rurik, the leader of the Swedish Vikings, became the Grand Duke of Novgorod and established the famous Rurik dynasty in Russian history. Due to the remote geographical location of Novgorod, there were many factors that were not conducive to development. Oleg, who succeeded Rurik, attacked the Dnieper River and occupied Kiev in 882, making Kiev his capital. Oleg worked hard and conquered the surrounding Slavic tribes. In 907, Oleg led 7,000 warships and more than 80,000 men to attack Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire, forcing the Byzantines to sign an agreement and pay tribute to the Vikings. Oleg's grandson Svetoslav continued to the Volga and Danube rivers and defeated the Bulgarian tribes there. Later, Sviatoslav was killed in an ambush. His son Vladimir repelled the invading enemies and consolidated the growing Russian Empire. In 988, the Byzantine king visited Russia and proposed a marriage between the two countries. He would marry his sister to Vladimir on the condition that Vladimir believed in Christianity. Vladimir accepted the suggestion, accepted baptism and forced the entire population to accept Christianity by force. In this way, this Viking regime established in Eastern Europe quickly integrated with Russian culture and became a new nation, the Russian nation. In the centuries-long conquest, the Vikings spread across Europe. At the same time, these centuries of conquest also became the final chapter of the Viking civilization epic. In the process of conquest, Viking civilization merged with local civilization, forming many new peoples, such as the Normans and Russians. The Vikings also gradually lost their own civilization and beliefs in this process. The influence of Christianity extended to these ideas, which were called barbarians by Western Europeans, and extended to every corner of Europe. That's it for today's show. If you haven't subscribed and liked it yet, please help me. I wish you all a nice day and see you in the next show.